This is Duke University.
Today we talk violence in Chicago, poverty in the United States, and the anniversary of the Occupy movement, as we're joined by journalists Rahiel Tesfamariam and Mychal Denzel Smith. My name is Anthony Neal, and this is Left to Black.
Yeah. Eric, you're a real life G for this one. Yeah.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Anthony Neal, and we're joined this afternoon by Rahiel Tesfamariam, who's the founder and editorial director of the online magazine Urban Cusp, and also a blogger and columnist for the Washington Post and The Root DC. We're also joined by Mychal Denzel Smith, a freelance writer and social commentator and mental health advocate, whose work has appeared in The Atlantic, The Nation, The Guardian, Ebony.com, The Huffington Post, The Root, The Griot, and Good. How are you folks doing this afternoon?
Wonderful.
I wanted to bring together just kind of to talk about some of the stuff that's going on that particularly is of interest to our communities. Chicago, of course, at least at the time that we're doing this interview, are still working through their strike in terms of public schools. But Chicago's very much been on the radar throughout the year because of the high rates of violence that are occurring in the city. One of your friends and colleagues, R. Lewis McCoy, just recently wrote a piece for Ebony.com, and he makes the point that we spend more time shaking our heads and being concerned than being active and engaging our young people to show them the rich legacies that they come from and even richer ones that they can build together. There's been a narrative, and it's not a new narrative, of course, about the kind of impact that hip-hop has had on Black American youth. It's a narrative that's taken another form now because of figures like Chief Keef in Chicago. Talk a little bit, Rahiel, about how you're processing all of this violence. I know you wrote a couple of pieces in your Washington Post blog over the last couple of weeks dealing with this violence that's occurring in the city of Chicago.
Well, it's heart-wrenching because no matter how often it happens, no matter how many times you hear the statistics, you never get used to it. And the hope is that we don't get used to it. I think the numbers in Chicago really touched me because it was coming so fast and the numbers were so high that I just thought about what it would be like to be a young person living in that city. I remember when we were plagued with violence in the summertime at a heightened level in DC, and you always thought about it in such a way as, it's here, it's imminent, how's it affecting my daily life? So I can't imagine what it's like when those numbers at 19 people being shot in a given night. So the fear, the paralyzing fear. And I guess my hope was that we wouldn't forget that these are still, in many ways, children, and if not children, they're teenagers. And I think when we connect them to hip hop, we often forget that innocence. We often forget that desire to grow up, to graduate, those dreams. So I think what Dumi's piece did in many ways is to say that they're no different than us. A lot of times if they're affiliated with gangs or crews, they're doing so because they want to be connected to a community. They want a sense of history. They want a sense of belonging and detachment. So in many ways, what it serves to do is to humanize them, because we can get so caught up in the artistry, in the culture, that they become a product of our culture and not really young people in search of meaning, in search of purpose, trying to figure out if they'll be around, and if they will, what meaning will there be to their lives.
Mychal, I was listening to Pharoah Monch, as I do fairly regularly. He has a beautiful song from his last recording called Still Standing. And he just throws off this little line about how he's doubled his life expectancy. And for yourself, I know it was when I was growing up, there was always this kind of narrative that we never expected to make it past the age of 25. How do you imagine young people, or imagining particularly young Black men, Black boys, are imagining their life expectancy in the context of the violence that we're seeing? You also do an incredible amount of work around the issue of mental health. How would you even address the mental health issues that many of these young men are dealing with, that of course they're never going to get any therapy and any treatment for in the context of trying to navigate, violent streets in Chicago and other American cities?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sitting on 25 right now, and when my cousin was shot and killed when I was 12 and he was 17, I imagine that, you know, a similar fate was going to fall upon me. Like that's the reality of being a black man in America. But I think, to your point, I think what we're talking about is when you listen to Chief Keef's song, the I Don't Like, what you hear is him rattle off a whole bunch of people or things that he doesn't like. And if you listen closely, most of them lead back to black men. Like he says, you know, forgive my language, he says, snitch niggas, that's the shit I don't like. Bitch niggas, that's the shit I don't. It's black men after black men. And then you have to start asking the question, why is it that our young black men don't love other black men?
Right.
And so I think that's the deficit that we're talking about. Why is it? I mean, when we're looking at the type of gang violence that we're seeing in Chicago, what we're looking at is a form of suicide. Yeah. And that's why we're talking about mental health. I mean, not just for the people affected by the shooting and the community growing up with that type of violence around them, but the people committing that type of violence. Why is it that they devalue themselves so much that they're willing to lose their lives over so little?
Yeah, Rahiel, you know, in your piece, one of your more recent pieces in the Washington Post, you asked a question in response to this violence about why it was so easy for us to come together and mobilize around Trayvon, but we don't see that same type of engagement in terms of the kind of violence that we're seeing in Chicago and other cities. You know, what do you imagine that's about? You know, why can't we bring ourselves to have the political will, both in our communities, but also in terms of the larger public, to really address these levels of violence, which, you know, are on epidemic, if not pandemic levels?
Right. A lot of people reduce the response to that question to, well, we knew who the killer was with Trayvon. So there was an easy end goal. You know, you arrest Zimmerman, and that was easy to mobilize around. And it's not as easy when you have masses of people who the police have yet to identify. There's immense retaliation. It's a domino effect of violence. I think it's much larger than that. I think in many ways, you know, we're living in a culture, and this is actually what I wrote about, where the media dictates what we care about.
Yeah, right.
You know, if we're told something is important, and I think with Trayvon, we saw it at a grassroots level, but in many ways, it started in the blog world, that a lot of bloggers were writing about it. I know that I got on it when I kept reading about it. And then after I kept reading about it, I said, I have to examine this case for myself, and did my own work to figure out this was something I want to stand behind. And I became myself obsessed with it. And I know Urban Cuss pushed the content out on a daily basis. And because of that, I know our followers got involved, and they started wearing hoodies and mobilizing at a local level. Right. And so created, you know, this very organic effect. But I think it took root in the media, independent media, that then got the attention of national media in many ways. I don't think it was a top-down thing. I think in many ways Trayvon was a bottom-up. And I don't think the media, whether it's independent bloggers or mainstream media, has really taken attention to Chicago in the same way. So the question then becomes, how do we care when mainstream media doesn't? You know, what tells us something is important if the media doesn't seem to be talking about it? Right.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined this afternoon by Rahiel Tesfamariam, who's the founder and editorial director of Urban Cuss magazine, also a blogger and columnist for the Washington Post and The Root DC. We're also joined by Mychal Denzel Smith, who's a freelance writer, social commentator, and advocate on mental health, whose work has appeared in The Atlantic, The Nation, Ebony.com, The Huffington Post, The Root, and The Grill. You mentioned a little bit about the concerns about how the media frames issues, and I think if there's another issue that the media has not paid a lot of attention to, of course, is this issue of poverty. The U.S. Census Bureau came out with a range of numbers last week talking about that there are more than 46 million Americans who are impoverished. The rate of poverty here in the United States is about 15%. But at the same time, we're looking at you know, larger numbers where the median income is about $50K, and at the same time, wealth amongst the top 5% in the United States increased. You know, while the wealth of those folks in that median, in fact, actually got much shorter. And so we see Cornel West and Tavis Smiley again kind of mount a poverty tour. And on the one hand, there are folks who, when they see Professor West and Tavis Smiley, you know, just kind of want to cringe and go, oh no, it's just these two Negroes again. But in some ways, there's some of the few folks, at least, who have a very wide kind of public visibility that are addressing anything around poverty. We clearly haven't heard anything around poverty coming from the two presidential candidates. Mychal, how do you feel about this issue around poverty and the kind of lack of attention that we see to it, not only in terms of mainstream media, but also in terms of political discourse?
Yeah, I think Tavis and Cornell have a point that, you know, no presidential candidates have made anti-poverty a central plank in their platform, and we haven't seen that. The only politician to do so in the past 30 some odd years was John
Edwards, right.
And, you know, he got caught up in that whole scandal, and so it disappeared from the discourse. And I mean, politicians used to talk about it, right? But that was before Nixon's Southern strategy and before Ronald Reagan's welfare cleans and before George Bush 1's Willie Horton, where essentially we painted the picture of poverty as black folk that want to take all your shit away from you. So so, you know, you're talking about Tavis and Cornell bringing up the issue of poverty, and, you know, everyone says, well, it would be much better if they weren't, you know, if they didn't have such petty grievances against Barack Obama, if they didn't feel like these personal slights against them. But the issue is, would we even be talking about their poverty tour if it weren't for those grievances that they have with Obama?
Right. You know, it's interesting because while we can be very critical of the president for his lack of attention, at least publicly, in talking about poverty, you know, we have had a few instances recently where the Republican nominee, Mitt Romney, has in fact made some comments about poverty. On the one hand, this notion where he talks about this 46 or 47% of folks who don't pay federal taxes, right? These would be these folks who would be impoverished. And he talks about the fact that, you know, what they actually need is to pull up their bootstraps. I mean, that's almost the language that he uses to describe their condition, that they need to stop complaining and work harder and be taught a better work ethic in terms of, instead of talking about the kind of structural impetuses that there are to them being able to more freely engage in quote unquote a free market economy. And also, you know, Governor Romney was asked about what he defined as, you know, middle income. And here we have the U.S. Census Bureau talking about a median income of $50,000, which, you know, if you're in a family of 4 or family of 5, you know, basically places you in the working poor and likely not home ownership and a whole range of other things. And he throws out numbers around $250,000 as being kind of middle class. You know, is part of this discourse, Rahiel, really connected to the notion that just black political figures in general, even the black political figures, are just frankly out of touch of what it means to be impoverished in the United States?
You know, I've personally been thinking about this a lot myself, and specifically in regards to my education. And you know, I can only claim my working class East African background for so long before someone says, you know, you're a graduate of Stanford and Yale. I think you can really connect to the poor. But I do think that there has to be a way to say that I bridged both worlds. And I've read, you know, things about Tavis' background. You know, Melissa Harris Perry's very touching story on her own show about what it means to live in a neighborhood surrounded by people who live with the risk of poverty every day.
Right.
And so what we're talking about is what you would call the black elite, always balancing that tension of knowing what that suffering is like and knowing what that divide is like, but being in a place of privilege. And I don't think that it's fair to not allow them to use the platform that they've been given to give voice to the things that they've seen and experienced. Because what happens is we're going to alienate those that are silent about it. And we're also going to criticize the ones that speak out about it and say that, you know, they don't really understand, they're profiting off of it. So it creates no space for anyone that has the platform to speak out in a way that really makes a difference. Because you're not poor enough or you're too rich and too elite. For me, it really goes back to Michelle Obama speech at the DNC. I mean, her main point in that speech, you know, that trumped the views that the RNC got, that in many ways surpassed the views of anyone else at the DNC, was that her husband, ultimately, President Obama, understands the policies and ways that Mitt Romney never, because he lived them. But it was the women that raised him and what it meant to grow up in a single parent home, or what it meant to to leave elite institutions like Harvard and decide to do, organizing work. What it means to make those kind of sacrifices when you have norms. I mean, so what we're talking about is when you carry that tension and that struggle in your body. And Mitt Romney doesn't. Ultimately, we know that he doesn't. And so who are those people that do? And are we going to give them the space and the freedom to name the things that other people are not empowered to name?
Yeah, and in some ways, it also gets back to a very practical political question, right? And this is for any candidate running for national office around the issue of poverty. Do poor people vote at a rate that it means that you're willing to take the political risk, right, to be able to name their struggle and their trauma and their situation with the idea that they'll be able to give back to you in certain kinds of ways. What we know about the American electoral process now, you got two candidates who aren't as far as we think they are, first of all, in terms of some policy, but they're basically fighting over 5% in the middle that hasn't made up their mind. They don't really care about those folks who are locked out of the political process, who have legitimate qualms about in terms of the quality of their life, which raises another point. And you're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Anthony Neal. We're joined by Rahiel Tesfamariam, the founder and editorial director of Urban Cuts magazine, and also Mychal Denzel Smith, a freelance writer and social commentator, who has written for TheRoot.com, The Griot, The Atlantic, The Nation, et cetera, et cetera. We're celebrating a year of the Occupy movement, the explosion of it. And in some ways, part of what the Occupy movement was trying to do was to be very clear about inequality, right? Social inequality, economic inequality in the United States. The messages didn't always hit, and let's say that part of that was, the fault of the mainstream media not wanting to give the Occupy movement the kind of time, for instance, that it gave, the teabag movement, for instance. But in the context of this anniversary, of course, there was an interview that Zadie Smith did with Jay-Z in the New York Times Magazine, and Jay-Z, Mr. Carter, says of the Occupy movement, I think all these things need to really declare themselves a bit more clearly. Because when you say that the 1% is that's not true. Yeah, the 1%, that's robbing people and deceiving people, these fixed mortgages and all these things, and then taking their home away from them, that's criminal, that's bad. Not being an entrepreneur, this is free enterprise. This is what America is built on. And of course, he caught a lot of criticism for that because in some technical way, he's part of the 1%. But how do you respond to a criticism from someone who's moneyed in the way that Jay-Z is? How do we take that kind of critique seriously given the concerns of folks in the 1%? And the easy argument is that, like you mentioned in terms of your own background, Rahiel, Jay-Z comes from a poverty-stricken background, right? But how much longer can he hold on to Marcy, as he goes forward and has his professional basketball teams and all these things going on? Either one of you can jump in and respond to that.
Well, I think first, I want to go back and say it's not that poor people aren't voting; it's the people that think the people that are voting don't think they're poor. Like
wow,
when we're talking about the poverty threshold in America, we're talking about $23,000 being the definition, the annual income definition of a family of four being the poverty line. Like that's ridiculously low,
right?
And that there are more people making more than that are poor. Like let's say and we can talk about the people that are living paycheck to paycheck and that are the near poor.
Right.
And when we start adding those numbers up, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people.
And that's why Mitt Romney's numbers are kind of interesting, right? Because those folks who are at $50,000 are struggling the same way, not the same way, right? But living paycheck to paycheck, it's a struggle. So how do we categorize those folks? Right. If we don't want to call them middle class and the poverty level says they're not impoverished, what is working poor, right? Does the average American actually know what the working poor is, right? But it also raises a kind of interesting question about aspiration. The whole Joe the Plumber moment, for instance, from 4 years ago or whenever it was, here's a guy who's concerned about what kind of policies the president's going to enact for folks who make over $200,000, and he had never made more than $50,000 in his life, but is identifying, with this idea of being middle income and voting against immediate interests because he aspires to other kinds of interests. And I think part of what you're saying, Mychal, there is also packed into that. You know, there are a lot of people who are in between the poverty line and say even immediate income who really are invested in this notion of becoming middle class, you know, and voting against policies that actually speak to where they are economically at this point in time.
And so, I mean, we're talking about people buying into the American dream.
Absolutely. And
what happened in the Great Recession that led to Occupy Wall Street is those people that felt like they were on the cusp of the American dream, or were, you know, had ready access to it,
and it's being threatened.
That access.
Right.
And so, you know, and I think the thing that Jay-Z and a lot of people in the 1% that, you know, is not the controlling 1%. We're talking about that, you know, that 0.1% that actually controls things. Right. But the people that feel like they're being demonized don't understand is that it's not a demonization of the rich. It's a pushback against the policies that favor the rich in you know, instead of helping out the people that feel like the American dream was built for them.
Yeah. Rahiel?
Add something to that. I mean, you know, I think the controversy recently with Harry Belafonte's comments about Jay-Z, even to the point that he said, you know, Bruce Springsteen, that's blackness for me. And I don't remember the exact words, but his point was that, you know, Beyonce and Jay-Z had reached a certain level of stardom and fortune, but they had done nothing with that, you know, to the benefit of the African-American struggle in America. And he, I think, used other celebrities who have given their money to charities as a way to the fight for social justice, to say, you know, blackness is not merely a color, but it's also a connection to a struggle. Yeah. So what this makes me think about is the disconnect that I think maybe someone like Jay-Z wants to have from that struggle, where he profits in some ways, you know, through the music and the telling of the story over and over again. I mean, he tells you about life in Marcy over and over again as if he had just lived it yesterday. But then again, he pushes back and says, you know, I'm in another space now, and I have a right to profit, and I have a right to live a world that doesn't always attach me to that suffering. So I guess the burden is, you know, in some ways we're saying no matter how far you've come, you're always faced with that burden. And it's a burden that white people don't often face. They make their money and they're able to do anything that they want with it. Whereas black people make their money and they're expected, you know, to use it in the community. Right. And I struggle with that. I really do, because I think ultimate freedom is when we arrive at a point where we carry our success as individuals and don't have to carry the burden of the entire community on our back. But I pause when someone made a lot of their success off of the suffering of that community, as Jay-Z did. You know, if his songs hadn't been about Marcy as much as they were, maybe he wouldn't be getting the criticism that he is getting now for Occupy Wall Street.
You know, it's interesting, right? It's kind of a slippery slope, because on the one hand, what is a legitimate role, for instance, of philanthropy, right? For the quote unquote black rich, you know, is philanthropy a legitimate way of giving back to community, right? And for Belafonte, right, this is not an old argument, right? This is the argument that he had 50 years ago with his best friend, Sidney Poitier. And, you know, Poitier is making the point that I give to the movement by writing checks, and he wrote a lot of them. You know, Belafonte is like, I wrote checks too, but I'm also committed in a kind of different kind of way. So in some ways, it's not a new debate. You know, by the same token, and this, you know, both of you have kind of mentioned some aspect of this. You know, we haven't done a really good job, and this could be the Occupy movement, the media in general, folks on the left, of really unpacking what exactly that 1% means. You know, Alex Rodriguez is part of the 1%, but Alex Rodriguez doesn't set policy. T. Boone Pickens attempts to. You know, the Koch brothers attempt to. And in some ways, you know, when we think about in terms of sheer economic reality, and I always talk about the term, you know, the 1% of the 1% is really, you know, who we need to be talking about. To be honest, Jay-Z and Diddy and Russell Simmons aren't a part of that 1% of the 1%, right? They're kind of locked out of that in some sort of ways. And so it's kind of a dilemma, right? Because at the same time, we don't want to be critical of the importance of building wealth, right? Building wealth is a way that you address debt and a range of other things. You know, how do we come up with a healthy idea around building wealth in the Black community that also recognizes that there are legitimate reasons why folks need to be engaged with folks to give back, if you will, because that's what we do, right? You know, this idea that we could compare ourselves to what white folks do, this is what we do, this is what we've always done. Any thoughts?
Well, I think just to talk about, you know, Jay-Z and the Black elite, essentially, the Black wealthy, it's an unsustainable model to think that
absolutely.
The only way to alleviate the sense of the poverty and, you know, in our communities is that a few people get rich and then they give back to the hood. Like it's simply unsustainable. You know what will help is a fair tax code. Like that. So that's where the fight needs to be, I think, if we're talking about, you know, why isn't Jay-Z buying computers for, you know, schools?
And Jay-Z has argued himself. Jay-Z has argued himself, right, that he needs to pay more taxes, right? I mean, and that's the kind of thing that nobody paid attention to, you know, in the midst of Occupy.
Yeah, and so building that system that, you know, fairly distributes the pie and helps alleviate poverty in a systemic way instead of, you know, piecemeal is where we need to focus the fight and not worry about how much is Jay-Z doing. I think everyone should feel some responsibility to their community and to the people that raised them, to the, you know, the area that made them. Yes, but it's just not going to completely alleviate the problems that we're talking about.
I just want to quickly say, but I do think it also speaks to a sort of nostalgia that we have for what, in many ways, the civil rights movement taught us about what our community's definition of success was about. You know, that was very much rooted in you make it so that you can help others make it. That it wasn't as individualistic. I don't think we had adopted America's sense of capitalism in the ways that we're seeing today. Not to say that it hasn't always been there, but I think that's part of the fear that many of us are resisting. You know, we bought too much into the system. Before, we would stand on the sidelines and critique it, understanding that there were values greater than just, you know, the uplift of the individual. So I think it gets a little deeper than just where does the profit come that sustains communities. I think it's also about the value systems. And so when Jay-Z's critiqued, I think he's critiqued for not beholding to a value system that in many ways helped him get to where he is today.
Yeah. We've been joined this afternoon by Rahiel Tesfamariam, who's the founder and editorial director of Urban Cuss magazine, and a blogger and a columnist for the Washington Post and the Root DC. Read her there as often. You every Tuesday, Rahiel?
Twice a week, so pretty much Tuesday and Friday.
Tuesday and Friday. And Mychal Denzel Smith is a freelance writer and social commentator and mental health advocate who you can read everywhere, most notably at The Atlantic, The Nation, The Guardian, Ebony.com, The HuffPost, The Root, The Griot, and Good. Thank you both for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Eric, you're a real life G for this one. Yeah. All black everything, all black you know, all black in the name of all my black heroes, all black everything, all black polos, all black medallions, yeah, all black you know, say, all black everything, all black you know, all black in the name of all my black heroes.